Good evening. I'm thankful that you're here. In the Bible reading plan that I follow, the gospel story that I'm reading this week comes from Matthew 25. And so I've been thinking about Matthew 25, and I'd like to share a few things here. In Matthew 25 and also in 24, Jesus tells a series of stories. These stories are all kind of told together, and the very last story in Matthew 25 actually kind of helps interpret all the other stories. And I want to kind of set up the first story that we're going to read, the first story in chapter 20, Matthew 25 that we're going to read tonight before we read it. And so here's kind of the scene that we're looking at that I want you to think about. It's the Tuesday before Jesus' death, and he's gathered with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. Jesus begins, as they're talking there on the mountain, spending time together, he begins to speak this prophetic word to his disciples. And he speaks about several things. The siege of Jerusalem. He speaks about the destruction of the temple. He also speaks about the coming of his return and also the last days. And some of the events that Jesus talked about that day have already happened. For example, the siege of Jerusalem happened in AD 70 along with the destruction of the temple that same year. But the other events have not happened, and so we are kind of living in between these events as we think about them here in Jesus' discourse that he shares with his disciples. So beginning in verse 1, I'm going to start reading in Matthew chapter 25. Jesus says, "At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 of them were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars, along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight the cry rang out, 'Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' Then all the 10 virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. But the foolish ones said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out.' 'No,' they replied, 'there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves.' But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others came also and said, 'Lord, Lord, let us in. Open the door for us.' But he replied, 'Truly I tell you, I don't know you.' Therefore, Jesus says, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." Jesus is coming. And this story is about being ready. In fact, all the stories in this section are all about being ready for the coming and the return of the Lord. They're all saying the same basic thing, but in different ways. And the last story about the sheep and the goats, it sort of helps us interpret the first two, the story here about the 10 virgins and the one that's after it about the talents. It helps us to understand them. And what I want you to notice in this story and the others that follow it, which we won't read for now, the main character is absent. The bridegroom in this story delays coming for a long time. Same with the other stories that follows it. In the story that follows the talents, the master goes off on a long journey. And the parable is about what happens in his absence. And the story about the sheep and the goats is about about the arrival of the king and judgment, about how we've treated people in the king's absence. Judgment is based on, in that story, is based on whether we acknowledged Jesus as king and lived according to that reality during Jesus' physical absence on earth. And I say physical absence because, of course, Jesus is still here in spirit. But Jesus is also coming. And now the question that led Jesus to tell these stories is actually found in Matthew 24, beginning in verse 3, when the disciples asked, "When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And that word coming that Jesus uses there is a Greek word, and it means presence or arrival. And it's used really throughout the New Testament to refer to the event of Jesus' return. And it's from that question that Jesus tells them, notice, not the specifics about his return, but to be ready for his return. So in our story, we have 10 virgins, 10 bridesmaids, 10 young girls. And the story says that 5 of them were wise and 5 of them were foolish. 5 were ready. They had lamps and oil, and they're called wise. And 5 had only their lamps, and they are called foolish. If you went to a wedding, you wouldn't be expecting it to last all night, would you? No, it would last a couple of hours, and then you'd be on your way. So it seems kind of silly, really, if you think about it, and I think Jesus is intentionally making it that way, to bring extra lamp for your oil if you're only going to be in an event for a few hours. But right away, what we notice is that Jesus flips. He flips and says that the wise ones are the ones that did bring extra oil. Because as it turns out, the bridegroom doesn't even show up until midnight. And so the wise girls were the ones that were prepared. They're ready when he shows up. And Jesus talks about this, and he helps us kind of imagine what it looks like to be people who are ready, who are waiting, who are anticipating the Lord's return. And in our day, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of talk about the Lord's return, a lot of speculation about when it will happen and how it will happen and what it will look like and how all that will play out. But that isn't what I want us to think about today. And honestly, I don't even think it's what this story and all the other stories around it are trying to accomplish, making us speculate more about Jesus' return. I would even go as far to say that anytime you hear someone speculating about Jesus' return, I think it's okay to be a little bit skeptical, because even Jesus says in Matthew 24:36, about that day, no one knows, not even, listen to this, think about this, the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And for that reason, I don't think these stories are intended to fuel further speculation about when Jesus will return. I think this story and the others around it are intended to give us hope of Jesus' return, to remind us that Jesus is coming, and really to inspire us to live in a state of readiness in a way that communicates that we're prepared, that we've been waiting and anticipating this moment all along. I want you to think about it for a minute. The coming of the Lord really, in the grand scheme of things that we believe as followers of Jesus, is the great hope of the church. It's the great hope of all of humanity. We'll spend an entire month celebrating this during the season of Advent that's coming up. But we have this hope all the time. And quite honestly, if you're like me, if it weren't for the hope that I have of Jesus returning to reign supreme over the earth, I would be a pessimist. I'd be discouraged about everything that is happening in our lives and in the world around us, because it can be discouraging, quite honestly. You can wonder when it is that God is actually going to do the thing that we believe God is going to do. But because of this hope, we are not pessimists and we are not discouraged. We are people of peace. We are people of hope. We are people of assurance. We can live our lives knowing that no matter what may come in this life, the King is coming. The bridegroom will show up. And the important thing is not for us to get all the details right about Christ's return, to speculate ourselves to death about what it'll be like or when it will be. The important thing for Jesus is to get us right, for us to be ready, for us to be living lives that communicate that we have been prepared and that we are waiting. Because see, if you're living the same way all the time, if you're the same person, if your character is intact and who you are who you say you are, then whenever the King comes back, is just fine with you. You see what I'm saying? It's not really that difficult, but it is, because we have to always be ready. And we have to be living our life in a way that conveys that truth. And so my hope is today that you will be encouraged to know that no matter what may come, no matter what may discourage you today, no matter what may disappoint you today, no matter what may let you down or make you feel depressed in some way today, may you know and be encouraged by the truth, by the promise that the King is coming. And the world's problems will come to an end. Your problems will come to an end. And while you walk on this earth, may you remember to keep watch. Keep your oil ready and your oil canister filled and your lamps trimmed, and as we patiently await for the return of our King. If you're here and watching this by yourself this evening, I'd invite you to reflect a little bit on this story. Does it bring you hope? Does it fill you with optimism to know and encouragement to know that the King is coming? If you're with others, I'd encourage you to spend some time reflecting on this story as well. Maybe talk about things that stand out to you, things that you notice from this story, what strikes you about what we've talked about tonight. And maybe think about how often it is that you think about Christ's return. How prepared are you? How ready are you? And why is it difficult, honestly, for us to be prepared and be ready as we live our lives, distracted by our to-do lists and our agendas and our jobs and parenting and finances and stress and discouragement disagreements, problems at work, problems at home, problems with life, right? Why in the midst of all of those things is the one thing that we fail to think about Christ's return? Well, today I hope that you do, and I hope that it brings you hope. I hope it brings you comfort. I hope you'll spend some time thinking about the comfort that it does bring as you see all of the things that are going on in your world through this filter of Christ's return, this truth and this promise that Jesus is coming. Grace and peace to you tonight. Thank you so much for watching. God bless.